Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's May 23rd. It's been far too long since we've had one of those batches of deep space updates. And so this is a batch of deep space updates. What an intro, right? No, let's of course start with the myriad of rocket launches. Well, not a myriad because that's like 10,000, but there's been lots of rocket launches, starting of course with a Starlink on May 6th from Cape Canaveral. But first interesting one is on May 7th. We had a Long March 6C taking a bunch of payloads to sun synchronous orbit, right? So the main payload was Hwang-Sing, or it was called Neptune. Neptune 1, which is an experimental, 250 kilogram media, like synthetic aperture radar satellite. So there's a couple of these on here. But importantly, the Long March 6C is a new rocket, right? So previously the Long March 6 had one engine, and then they made the Long March 6A, which had two engines and then boosters. And so the 6C has the two engines, no boosters, and I think it's a little bit shorter. So it's capable of putting like 2.5 tons into sun synchronous orbit, whereas the 6A with the boosters can put about 4.5 tons. So anyway, launch was successful, another new Long March. And I'm actually going to have to make another video about all the new types of Chinese rockets. We've got so many. 8th of May, Starlink LC-39 in Florida. We know this. 9th of May, Long March 3B/E to medium Earth orbit. So this is like their communication satellites up around the same altitude as GPS. So this launched from Xichang. And the satellites are communication satellites called Zhihui Tianwan 1 and 2, or in English, Skynet 1 and 2. And if you're a fan of Terminator, you know what's going on there. But no, these are China's first communication satellites in medium Earth orbit. That's about 20,000 kilometers up between geostationary orbit and low Earth orbit. 10th of May, Falcon 9 out of Vandenberg carrying a group of Starlink satellites. And the interesting one about this one is it launched into the middle of a pretty spectacular geomagnetic storm. So I was literally standing up in the hilltop waiting to see this when they kept on pushing it back, and we missed it. But we knew that the sun had just popped out a whole bunch of massive coronal mass ejections. And there was definitely some concern that maybe some of the Starlink satellites would be lost, because we've previously seen this when there was a solar storm. It causes the outer atmosphere of the Earth to balloon out, and the Starlink satellites launched into low Earth orbits have a hard time gaining altitude because they only have very low thrust argon thrusters. Now, apparently that wasn't a problem this time. However, looks like during this geomagnetic storm, there was a number of Starlink issues, communications issues in general, which means Starlink. But of course, there were a whole bunch of amazing images coming from people all over the world. And it was even barely visible in California, which means this was like a massive, massive storm. It was the first G5 storm in like 20 years. So anyway, 11th of May, Long March 4C carrying Shiyan 23, which means experimental satellite out of Jiuquan into a sun synchronous orbit. And of course, Shiyan, we don't know very much. It's a Chinese technology demonstrator satellite, reportedly for monitoring the space environment, and that could mean geomagnetic fields, or it could mean spying on other satellites for all we know. 13th of May, Starlink 23 satellites out of Florida. 14th of May, Starlink out of Vandenberg, and that's a pretty fast turnaround, 5 days. Impressive job, SpaceX. So this is another Group 8, and it's the 50th flight by SpaceX this year, so congratulations on that one. 16th of May, Soyuz Fregat out of Plesetsk carrying Cosmos 2576. What is this? Well, that's a good question. So it launched a total of 6 satellites. Initially, one satellite got launched, and then there's a bunch of other payloads dropped on other orbits. And this satellite did launch into an orbit which is suspiciously close to the orbital plane of a US KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, which is a big-ass Hubble-type telescope, right? It's like the Hubble Space Telescope, except it's the Hubble Earth Telescope called Keyhole. And so definitely looks like an inspector satellite, but the US, as I've said, they believe this is a weapon which I guess is technically true because anything moving at orbital velocity could be considered a weapon. But it looks like an inspector satellite based upon its close matching orbit right now and the fact that it's not flying past this target particularly fast. Anyway, 18th May, another Starlink launch out of Florida. This one is significant because it was booster 1062 and that was the 21st flight and recovery. Yes, this thing is looking pretty dark, but it looks like it's going to continue to fly. They're going to push out that envelope and see how far they get. 21, legal to drink or something like that. 21st of May, Kuaizhou, Chinese rocket carrying 4 satellites to sun-synchronous orbit. The most important one being Wuhan 1, built by Wuhan University, a location which many Americans had never heard of until about 4 years ago. So Wuhan 1 is a meteorological satellite with, apparently has like modern onboard computational capabilities, which marketing people are trying to say AI, but you know, AI is just statistics, right? So it's got a whole bunch of onboard processing. Not really sure how that's going to help it, but definitely they're doing it. 22nd of May, Falcon 9 out of Vandenberg carrying Star Shield. I know you thinking it was Starlink. No, it's Star Shield. NROL 146. Now, this is of course the military side of this operation. It's apparently built with sensors, developed by Northrop Grumman. We got no upper stage images. We did see some great footage of the booster going all the way up and coming all the way down, right down to a landing, which didn't look particularly good, but I haven't seen any images of it coming back into port. So anyway, interestingly, like we don't know how many satellites were on board. But given that this was a barge landing, that does tend to constrain the mass to be above a certain threshold. Of course, if they were wanting to hide the actual mass, they might just put it out to the ocean just to discuss that. But then we could actually look at the acceleration curve and whatever, right? We don't know how many satellites were on this. We don't know what the capabilities are. But yeah, NRO doing their thing. Finally, 23rd of May, Falcon 9 launching another batch of Starlink out of Florida just this morning, and there'll be another batch of Starlink like literally in a couple of hours, and that'll have to go in the next episode. But over the weekend, it was perhaps a more interesting launch. Blue Origin, New Shepard 25. It's their first crewed flight since September of 2022. Right, and this was obviously, they stopped flying people for a while. I say crewed flight, they're not crew, they are just passengers. This is like a meat payload with arms and legs and dreams and aspirations and cool people, right? So this one in particular featured a guy called Ed Dwight, who is a 90-year-old former US Air Force pilot who in 1961, the Kennedy administration basically sort of tried to get him in to be the first black astronaut. That didn't happen. And this was his actual flight to space. And that makes him apparently the oldest person to fly to space. Now, on the return, there was a minor issue with the parachutes. There's 3 parachutes on this. And as they open, one of them did not deploy correctly. So we have 2 good chutes and 1 chute which the lines were being held together. So it was more like a balloon-shaped thing. And this is common in parachutes that are deployed at high speed, like on aircraft ballistic parachute systems. They'll have like a restriction system, right, which then is released. This is a reefing system which allows the chute to expand slowly and reduce the amount of the onset of deceleration. Or, in technical terms, jerk. Yes. That's where your acceleration rises really quickly. That is called jerk. So anyway, it looks like there's been a problem. I'm not clear exactly how the parachute mechanism works on Blue Origin because I couldn't find any good images. I'm not clear if it's the same type that I have on like the Cirrus or if this is something else. But as for the crew, well, I think you just have to take a look. Obviously this was designed to handle parachute failures. And when we got down, how did the 90-year-old person handle that? Well, he jumped out. He was super excited. He stated, "This was a life-changing experience. I thought I didn't need it in my life, but I lied." Yes, I think that's a sign that the touchdown was soft enough and survivable. So, yes, while one of the parachutes didn't deploy correctly, I believe that the FAA isn't like gonna do like the whole mishap and ground the system until that's checked out. That's gonna be on Blue Origin. But anyway, the other big launch that we had expected to happen was Starliner, and we got all the way up into the crew, into the vehicle fueled up, getting ready to go, and they had to scrub. And it was scrubbed because of a chattering valve on the Centaur, which is bizarre because the Centaur is, of course, one of those pieces of equipment which is incredibly reliable. Its history goes back many, many decades. I mean, it's got more heritage than the rocket that it's riding on, which was radically rebuilt for the Atlas V. Starliner is, of course, brand new, and we were expecting all sorts of problems. So chattering, basically you've got pressure underneath it and the valve is opening and closing due to this pressure. I think it's like a pressure relief valve, and it's supposed to like open and stay open for a certain amount of time and then close. Well, you know, if the valve gets into a state where it's opening and closing very quickly, and according to Torre Bruno, it was opening and closing at a rate of 40 hertz, so it was like a low bass note that was audible to teams at the launch site. So on other launches, this might not have mattered. It is a pressure relief valve, right? As long as it wasn't getting stuck closed, as long as it wasn't getting stuck open, that was something they might have flown with. But because this was the first launch of Starliner, they were like, no, we need to check into this. Initially, they thought they might be able to just make it, fix it and launch the next day. Then they were like, no, we need to actually replace the valve. And if you're replacing the valve in a Centaur, that is not a trivial problem because a Centaur is a pressure stabilized structure. And if you're going to take the valve off, you need to somehow contain the pressure inside that, which means, no, they couldn't do that. They had to roll it back to the vertical integration facility, essentially erect bracing to support the load, then change out the valve. And during this, it was then discovered that there was a problem with a small helium leak in the Starliner service module, which was traced to part of the RCS system, and this has been causing a problem for the past few weeks now. I think we might get an announcement tomorrow. I think I'm still seeing that it might fly on June 1st, but this has clearly been delayed. And I think the longer Starliner sits on top of the rocket, the more likely that something else is going to age out, because there's a lot of systems that have time limits on them. Once they've been powered up or fueled up or used for the first time, there's going to be a lifespan that's on this, and it might be a couple of months, right? So it's entirely possible they have to demate Starliner if they can't get this fixed, roll it back, fix that, replace parts, and then put it back on the rocket. Now, NASA has apparently cleared the ISS schedule to leave a large window, but at some point there's gonna run into a limit, and they're gonna need to, fly actual cargo to the space station. Yeah, big problem. Also, another spacecraft, Dream Chaser. Remember, it was potentially in the running to be a human launch vehicle. Well, Dream Chaser has now completed its stint in the long duration vacuum thermal chamber at Armstrong. It has passed it. It's now being shipped to Florida, where it's going to do more testing. It's going to be testing for like EM emissions and vibration and everything. It's currently mated to the Shooting Star logistics module. And assuming it passes all this, there's a few more things that need to be done to the heat shield, obviously some integration stuff, but they are hopefully going to be ready to launch before the end of the year. And that's going to be another flight for Vulcan. Still not clear whether this will be the second flight on Vulcan. It's really, if there's another payload, they might switch that up and go first. But yeah, I'm hoping to see Dream Chaser launch and hoping that Starliner does actually launch, because it really just get that thing out of the way, right? Come on. Rocket Lab, they started showing off new images of their Archimedes engines as they are beginning testing on the test stands at Stennis Space Center. Now, So these are their new, methyl ox engines. They're 75 tons of thrust, staged combustion, and they need to verify that they can actually start up these engines. They've done obviously all the theoretical modeling, because starting a staged combustion engine is complicated. You have to do everything in a certain sequence, make sure that your pressures don't flow back on themselves, because everything is sort of linked in loops, So they need to verify this works. Unfortunately, because they're not on schedule, it looks like they've pushed back Neutron to 2025. Just a couple of months ago, they were still thinking they could do it in 2024, but that optimism has slipped away, and so Neutron's launch has now slipped into 2025. Another company testing rocket hardware and making me very happy is Rocket Factory Augsburg, who I have this rocket here, which is their RFA-1 built in Lego. Unfortunately, I couldn't find all the correct color pieces. There's some pink parts on that. They're testing the first stage of their RFA-1 rocket in Scotland at Saxa Vord spaceport. Okay, technically it's Shetland, which isn't mainland Scotland, but it's Scotland as far as I'm concerned. I am really excited. They did a hot fire of four Helix engines. Basically, they ignited them one at a time on this test stand, 4 seconds apart, until they had 4 of them running, and they ran them simultaneously for like another 8 seconds, basically giving them a total hot fire duration of 20 seconds. And they say that it ran flawlessly, and I'm very happy to hear that. So that is only a subset of the engines on this rocket. It's supposed to have 9 engines on its first stage. It obviously has a second stage with a single engine. Rocket RFA, they were ambitious. The Helix engine is a closed cycle, staged combustion, high performance engine. This rocket is capable of putting about 1.3 tons into low Earth orbit, which makes it comparable to Firefly's Alpha. But it's going to be launching from Scotland. I mentioned the solar storms, which everybody all over the globe saw. Well, there was also a pretty impressive bolide over Portugal. It actually started over Spain, flew over Portugal, headed to the northwest and out over the Atlantic. And there's several amazing pieces of footage from this, and it looks like it was very bright. Like some magnitude estimates put it at -22, and the sun is -27. So that's within 1% of the brightness of the sun at midday. Yeah, as I said, there was some great pieces of footage. My favorite one is these teenagers that were just filming themselves and reacting, and you see this thing passing over above the clouds, and there's many layers of clouds. That was magical. Some people, with so many cameras in the world, some of them are bound to create perfection just by accident. Astrobotic, they are showing off the Zogdor reusable, suborbital rocket. Now, this is something that began at Masten Space Systems. It's basically a sounding rocket that's supposed to be reusable, flies up at Mach 3.5, takes payloads above 100 kilometers, and then returns and lands like a rocket. Like rockets, like a SpaceX rocket rather than, say, a Chinese rocket right now. So it's 27 foot tall, 3 feet in diameter, and obviously named after Trogdor the Burninator, who, if you don't know, then you need to watch more Strong Bad, because, seriously, why do you not know about Strong Bad? This is something that they acquired when Masten went out of business. Astrobotic ended up with it, and I like the technology. I'd really like to see more reusable rockets happening. And speaking of reusable rockets, of course, the mother of all reusable rockets, which one day may actually be reused, is Starship and Super Heavy. They have performed a wet dress rehearsal down at Boca Chica for launch number 4, IFT-4. We're told it's probably going to happen within 10 days, so that is the first couple of days of June. Very exciting. It sounds like the FAA are not requiring the closure of the investigation into IFT-3. They're going to be able to move onwards, and we won't necessarily find out what happened exactly with IFT-3 until much later. but we can obviously wish for some success on that. I mean, so we've seen some other dramatic events in the last few days. Obviously, we've now got multiple test sites happening. Over at the Massey Road area, we've been seeing Starships test fired, and I think there was one, I think it was there, where they were testing Starship number 31 and something went wrong and it looked like a big sparking light. And we believe that there was like some electrical short circuit which was creating a lot of violent looking stuff. It didn't look that damaged, but it has been wheeled back to the high bay to do inspections. And hey, you know, if this is an electrical problem that is potentially in other Starships, they may have to fix those as well. Also, literally a few hours ago, there was a fairly spectacular Raptor explosion at the McGregor facility. They were doing like a vertical test, and I think as soon as it started firing, it looked to me like there was a leak in the power head or something. And eventually that erupted into a big fireball. The stand isn't particularly damaged. It doesn't look like it was a detonation, more like a deflagration. Spectacular, but bad for the engine, probably not so bad for the test stand. Okay, elsewhere. United Launch Alliance, story came up this week that they are investigating potentially using an airship to move rocket stages about. I don't expect this to happen, but I really want it to see happen. Rocket stages, there's definitely, I could see that would be a good idea. Like, if you think about it, rocket stages are sort of big, and you can actually fill them with hydrogen or helium and make it easier to move. And the current rocket ship is not that fast. And I don't know, I just want to see more airships, honestly. And maybe one day I can learn to fly an airship. Vast, do you remember the Vast? They are building their little miniature space station, pretty much funded by, cryptocurrency investments. And they put out some images, some video, showing fabrication of their test article. So essentially what they want to do is verify that their production capabilities are producing materials that are consistent with the quality needed. So they've got this test object where there's like two different radius sections, and then there's conical sections joining them and an end section. And so they've built this. They start out with thick aluminium, and they've machined it out into an orthogrid style and then bent those and welded those. All those fabrication steps are going to be essentially tested by this. They're going to make sure that this subscale, or not, it's not even subscale, that this thing, which is not a functional object, all the structural parts are working correctly. Firefly. So I've been trying to get back to Firefly after seeing there in January, but Firefly Aerospace investors are reputedly considering a sale. And the sale could be potentially at $1.5 billion. Now, who would pay $1.5 billion for Firefly? Well, Northrop Grumman seemed like an obvious choice, given that they have already put money in, or they've already invested in Firefly. They've given them contracts to build out the replacement for Antares. And if Northrop Grumman want to stay in the rocket market, they would be the best investor. But it doesn't mean that they're not the only one. There's other potential people that might want to own it. And if they did, that would certainly change the dynamic with Northrop Grumman. And finally, just today, I heard there was an update on the CLIPS program which stated that the launch of Viper is now delayed to 2025. And I haven't actually got the detail on this, but the thing about Viper is that it is a mission to the lunar pole, the lunar South Pole. And for that, it has to be when the polar axis of the moon is pointed towards the sun. Otherwise, it's permanent darkness. And that's only going to happen from November until March, April next year. So if they launch first day of 2025, they're going to have lost, 30 plus days of potential lunar surface activity. So if they are delaying to 2025, I hope this means they're actually delaying it until October so that they can actually take full advantage of their time on the lunar surface. I don't know. We'll get some updates on that in the coming weeks. But that is my piece. That is all the stuff. I'm still looking forward to Starliner launching. And honestly, we're pretty sure that we honestly, we could also see Starship launch. Heck, based on the schedule, they could be launching on the same day. Wouldn't that be stunning? I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.